The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of NAMI New Hampshire or the organization's funders. All individuals and personal experiences are different. Please connect with your primary care provider or a mental health professional to seek advice regarding any condition you may experience. NAMI New Hampshire does not endorse or advise specific treatments. For 24/7 crisis help, call or text 988 to reach the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline.
It's time we talked about it. I'm getting tired of living without it. The things in my life just don't make any sense. Each day I wake in the morning, but every day just feels so boring. I don't understand just what I need to change. It's up to you to want to do the things you want to do. And though it's temporary, feeling sad can be so scary. I love the ones who understand me. I never wanna feel so angry. I never wanna feel like this again.
Welcome to the 603 Stories Podcast, a monthly mental health podcast made by young adults for young adults, where we share stories, make connections, and find hope. Any ads throughout this podcast are not associated with 603 Stories or the 603 Stories podcast. There will be sensitive subjects discussed during this podcast. Should you need support, the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is available 24/7 by calling or texting 988.
Hello and welcome back to 603 Stories, a mental health podcast made by young adults for young adults. I'm Jace, my pronouns are he, him, his, and I'll be one of your co-hosts today.
And I'm Heather. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm your other co-host here on 603 Stories. Before we dive in, I do want to remind you that Jason and I are not mental health professionals. We're just two young folks who are passionate about mental health and sharing these conversations with you. Today, we have a wonderful guest here to talk about suicide prevention.
So to start, let's meet our guest for today's episode. Abby, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, my name's Abby Porter, and my pronouns are she, her. And some things I'm interested in is definitely working and going to the gym. I love that. It's very good to clear my mind. And I work with children at an after-school center, and then I work at a wellness center, and I do some work with NAMI. That's how I got involved with this by like the connection sessions. And then I find mental wellness being so important to me because not only of my own struggles, but like the struggles I see teens around me go through. So that's why it's like such an important topic to me.
Thank you so much, Abby. I am so excited to have you here today. Before we really dive into the bulk of the topic, can you explain what the connection sessions are?
Yeah, so at my school, I know it kind of varies like different for each school that participates in it, but the Connection Suicide Prevention Program is basically um youth and peers teaching to peers about suicide and how to prevent it and the signs of suicide.
Very important. When did you become a youth leader, or how long have you been a youth leader for?
So I'm a senior now in high school, and I first got introduced to it my freshman year of high school. And it's when I actually saw a bunch of like the past youth, that we call them youth leaders, come into my health class and give the presentation. And I was like, oh, I definitely want to be a part of this. So I reached out to the person who runs it at my school, and then I started training like first thing beginning of sophomore year. So I've been a certified youth leader since beginning of sophomore year all the way to now. So about like two years.
Very good.
Yeah.
So you signed up for it because you saw other youth leaders doing it. It's not something that your whole grade did.
No, it's not something that my whole grade did. It was you to get involved with it, you have to kind of reach out to our guidance department or someone involved in the program, And then through that, you have to go through a whole lengthy training process and get what we call like certified, and we actually get a certification and everything to be a youth leader.
What does the certification process look like?
So the certification process looks like basically we usually have someone from NAMI come help us, and every single year for us it's been Ann Douglas, and she helps us train for about 7 to 8 hours that day, and we just stop for one break. We stop for lunch, but we get like an hour break, and it basically consists of like all the topics you would need to know about suicide. So like warnings, how to connect a person with help, what it looks like in youth, what it looks like in adults, and basically like all of that, everything you would need to know.
In your opinion, why do you think that it's important for youth and young adults to be trained in suicide prevention and not just adults?
I think I think it's so important because I see that many people in my school struggle, and like just teens in general. And speaking from personal experience, I think it's so much meaningful when you have someone your age and like a friend or a peer reach out to you and ask you for help than like an adult. Because I think a lot of kids don't take it as seriously when adults asking because they're like, oh, you don't get me. But then if they realize like their peers get them and they're there to help, they take it more seriously. And that's what I've noticed.
Mm.
Thank you. First of all, this is such important work. So thank you for doing it and thank you for coming and sharing with us. I'm curious, how do you feel like this program has impacted you as an individual, and how do you see it impacting your school community as a whole?
It's impacted me as an individual because it's gotten me, not only like does it help me like with my mental well-being, but like knowing warning signs for myself and for like my loved ones, but also it's helped me a lot with getting into the mental health community and being able to have experiences like working with NAMI and getting on this podcast and other stuff, which has been so wonderful for me. And then I feel like it's impacted my school by not only when I go into classrooms do I feel like a growth in the community, in the classroom and also just in the school, but generally seeing how interested kids are in it and how much kids care really does. I think not only is it inspirational to like the teachers, but it really does impact everyone around them because then kids realize that they can trust more peers than they think. That's what I've noticed a lot going into classrooms.
Thank you. Can I ask, what do the interactions with your peers look like? How do you implement the tools that you've learned?
Yeah, so we always do this like, well, we have a game show activity where we basically read facts off of like we have certain categories and we read facts about suicide or like true or false questions, and then they have to answer them, which that usually gets like a lot of conversation involved, which is awesome. And sometimes it literally goes on for like a whole hour of just conversations about one topic, and it's awesome. It's really awesome to see. And then another one that we usually do that causes a lot of conversation is basically just asking them about stigma and the stigma they've heard around not only about say like a certain topic, but then we relate it back to suicide and we say, oh well, what stigma have you heard about around suicide? And then they usually have like spot on answers, whether it's, oh, like if you talk about someone being suicidal, they'll then have suicidal thoughts, or well, males aren't supposed to talk about it because it's like a hush hush topic. Like they're always spot on. So
What are some of the responses that are given to those examples that you gave?
we usually will always say like, first of all, talking about suicide does not necessarily cause someone to be suicidal. It actually leads someone in the right direction to help, because then they know that you're a trustworthy person, or also if you hear someone saying it to you, then you'll be able to get help for them. And then the male stigma is like such a huge one that always gets brought up. And we always just emphasize that like everyone's human, males, females, no matter what you identify as. And there's no reason to put like a stereotype on emotions because everyone has them. And yeah, that's like the main emphasis that we always do when people bring up male like stigma or stuff around mental health in males.
I appreciate all of those answers. I guess I'm curious, what is the environment like when you typically have these conversations? I know you mentioned that your peer leaders came into your health class. Is it typically facilitated in like a smaller group class style? Is it like a school assembly? Like what do these scenarios look like?
And are people kind of
So
closed off at first, or are they open to it
Receptive?
immediately? Yeah, are they receptive to this conversation pretty quickly?
So we usually go into, luckily in my town, we go into like all different age groups. We do all the age groups in the high school, and then we do the age groups in our middle school, which is awesome because I think young kids need to be exposed to that as well. But depending on what class we go to, we usually go to the health classes. Sometimes the classes can be smaller. Like the smallest class I've ever had was 8 kids in a class. And then the largest class I've ever had was 30 kids in a class. And it honestly, when you go in there, you can already kind of tell the vibe of like when you're presenting that some kids are going to be closed off. And like immediately once you ask a question, it's usually kids will instantly react or you'll see them being like hesitant. But I honestly have noticed that once we start the game show activity, all the kids start talking, even if it's like before they were talking none and now they're at least getting like 3 sentences in. It helps them talk a lot, and a lot of kids have a lot to say because it's most of them are opinion based, so kids usually speak up right away.
Do you feel like this is typically the first time that young folks are having these conversations?
I do think for some kids it is like the first time they're having these conversations because even when I look out in the crowd when I'm presenting, I can tell some kids are like genuinely just like feel awkward or uncomfortable and like their face is red, and I can just tell that they're probably not used to ever talking about this topic.
Does it seem like afterwards they feel more comfortable not only having these conversations, but having these conversations in a meaningful way and more confident being able to ask their peers, are you feeling suicidal? Do they just seem more equipped to handle these conversations?
Yes, they definitely do. They seem like way more relaxed. Like it's almost like I almost see it like I feel like when it gets brought up, they almost think that it's going to be like this horrible thing, and I can see it on their face and they're like they're waiting for like some kind of, I don't know, like it always looks like it immediately gets negative for them, for like the certain kids that I can tell don't talk about it a lot. But then after the fact, when everything's done, I can just like visibly see on their face, like they feel better, like they feel better about themselves and the environment around them. And I think they finally realize, like, oh, it's not such a bad topic. Like it doesn't always have to be a negative thing.
Yeah, and we
What do
can talk
you,
about it. And you never know who's impacted by it. I know I personally lost my grandfather to suicide when I was in second grade. So I knew about suicide from a very young age, but like you said, it was very hush hush. Like no one ever talked about it because of that stigma. And
Mhm.
I remember the first time that we had any kind of like suicide awareness class or curriculum or anything. And I was like, yes, like we need to be talking about this. And
Yeah.
I finally felt like, oh my gosh, this is a real thing. And it's not something that I have to keep a secret anymore. So it's the work you're doing is extremely, extremely important.
Thank you.
I'm so impressed by folks your age. First of all, I feel like you're just way ahead of everyone else when it comes to this. And I absolutely love and adore that. It's so necessary and it's so refreshing. Um, and you're so powerful. Like
Oh my
being
gosh.
able to see young people make active change and like feeling so empowered to do it, seeing like the need and acting on that, it's just really, really valuable and it makes me feel good.
Good, I'm glad. That's why I do it. I just want to be able to help people and make a difference. So
Well, you definitely are. Real quick, earlier you mentioned that you do this presentation for high school students, but you also do it for middle school students.
yes.
Is the content or the presentation that you're sharing any different for those age groups, or is it the same across the board?
It's pretty much the same. We just kind of have to cut the content somewhat shorter because our high school classes are an hour and a half long. The middle schools is 45 minutes.
Hmm.
But we basically get through the same amount of content and we'll still use the same language. If we need to, we will explain more thoroughly about certain topics because if we're like, oh, you know what, like a seventh grader might not know what this means or an eighth grader might not know what this means,
Right.
we'll go into further explanation. But other than that, the content's relatively the same. Yeah.
What do you feel like the differences with response from the two age groups?
Mm, I feel I feel like okay, this is gonna sound crazy because most of the time I say this, people are like, "Wait, what?" But the eighth graders or seventh graders, that's what we usually present to in the middle school. Their answers tend to be way more thought out and accurate than the high schoolers.
That is so interesting. I wonder why that is.
I know. I find I find it very
Mhm.
interesting too, and I honestly don't know. I don't know if it's just because I feel like at the high school age, it's such I don't know, it's just such a negative stigma literally around mental
Mhm.
health issues, or if it's because I know even the generation younger than me, they're starting to get brought up way more on mental health awareness and everything. When I know some kids my age didn't at all, but yeah, it's so interesting to me.
That's a great point. I didn't even think about that, how we are having these conversations more and more. And so, or the younger the kids we are having these conversations with, are, the more that they've been exposed to this language and conversation already.
Yeah.
Hmm. Very
You don't need
interesting.
to break down the stigma in high school if it's never planted. By
Right.
having, honest conversations about mental health and self-care when folks are young and teaching them how to, ground themselves or process emotions
Yeah.
in age appropriate ways, I think just sets them up for, more honest conversations moving forward.
I wonder if
Yeah.
there's social emotional learning, because I don't know when social emotional learning started necessarily at like in each school district kind of thing, but I wonder if those conversations have been had with folks like you said, Heather, self-care and making sure that we're talking about these things and just starting the conversation early so that there isn't that stigma when we get older. And so I wonder where that cutoff is, where social emotional learning in schools started versus where it ended, and how that impacts these suicide prevention conversations that are happening.
Yeah. Me too. Now that you mention that, I'm really curious about that.
Because I didn't have social emotional learning, I don't think, when I was in elementary school.
Yeah. I work with
But
elementary
yeah.
school kids and they do. They have social emotional learning, which is so crazy to me because I never had that in elementary school either. But it's awesome to see because at least I see kids who are generally aware of their emotions and know how to speak about it more clearly when there's a problem, which honestly I was like, there's kids in my grade who don't know how to do that and we're 18 years old and you're doing it at 8 years old. So it's really awesome to see though.
Some
I
days
promise
I say
there's
that about
folks in
myself as well. Like, I don't know.
there's definitely folks, 20s, 30s, all the way up who also don't know how to regulate themselves emotionally. So, again, just so impressed by the growth of young folks and being able to see the massive change from when I was in middle school to middle school now. It gives me a lot of hope for the future and, preventing a lot of pain from happening in the first place.
So Abby, what are some things that you think everyone should be aware of when it comes to suicide prevention, when it comes to taking care of our mental wellness or even looking out for others?
I would say definitely look for like the common warning signs or like early warning signs of someone who might be suicidal. And the first thing I would say, like ultimately doing, even though some people are so scared to do it, just get help, whether it's for yourself or whether it's for a loved one. There's definitely someone out there who can help. And I know some people might not be like financially stable enough to hire a therapist or a psychologist, anything like that. But there's help in communities, there's help at schools with guidance counselors. And yeah, my biggest emphasis has to be like just get the help that the person needs.
So I'm an adult who does do work with middle schoolers and high schoolers, but specifically I'm thinking of I facilitate mental health first aid, which is a program for teenagers in 10th through 12th grade, about accessing mental health supports and knowing warning signs. I'm interested to hear like what's some advice that you would give to an adult that's having these conversations with young folks?
So I would say for an adult, definitely just be very open and try to be understanding to the youth, like whatever, if it's your kid, if it's your kid's friend or whatever youth it may be, just be open and understanding because I feel like a lot of the time where the adults fall short that makes our generation more nervous to talk to adults is because we don't think that they have a clear understanding of what we're trying to say or they don't want to listen. And that makes a lot of kids my age push away from adults. So I think the first thing would just be like go into it with an open mind and genuinely try to listen. And then I think the next thing that would be so beneficial for like the adult and the youth to connect with is finding a support system, like a support network, whether it's with them and the rest of their family or a group of friends and a group of peers and a group of adults and putting them all together. But I definitely think like an adult helping a youth get a network can be so helpful.
That is so important. And the time that I helped facilitate a Connect suicide prevention training, the one thing that I really walked away with that really kind of took me by surprise a little bit, but I found to be extremely important is that even trained professionals in the mental health field don't handle difficult or crisis situations alone. And I don't know why I always thought that they did, or maybe I just never thought about it. But even trained professionals don't handle these situations alone because they are difficult, they are heavy, and they are emotionally taxing. And so, if even the professionals don't handle these situations alone, then none of us should be handling them alone. And everyone deserves to have that support network to help us work through these situations, whether it be ourselves or us helping a friend or a family member. We all deserve to have that support system.
Absolutely.
Outside of recommending a support system, what are some of the resources that you typically access or recommend?
So I recommend I recommend like to my peers at school. We're very lucky to have like an amazing guidance department. So I'll always recommend people to go there. And then I'll recommend like any resources or anything you can get on the NAMI page. I always suggest that. And then I always also suggest the crisis line, like the 988, and I'll say either text it or call it, whatever feels more helpful to you or personal to you. But those are the three that I always tend to tell peers when they come up to me.
And it's important to remember that you can text 988 because a lot of young adults and even youth are not ones to pick up the phone all the time.
Yeah.
I know myself personally, if I can do something online, I will. If I can order a pizza online instead of calling it in, that's what I'm doing. And honestly, same goes for support, whether that's crisis lines, warm lines, hotlines. Knowing that there's a texting option can relieve a lot of stress for people. And honestly, I think it's a beautiful thing that they incorporated that.
Yes.
So you're clearly navigating some pretty heavy topics. But what do you do to de-stress and take care of yourself, both on a day-to-day basis and, after you've had some difficult conversations?
Yeah. So I love just like exercising. I love running and cycling. That's like two things I absolutely love doing. Um, I tend to meditate and journal. I'll do a lot of that. I try to at least journal. I mean, I have to I have to be better about it lately, but I usually try to journal at least once a week. Even if I don't have anything to do, even if it's like, oh, I had a good week this week, I'll just write about that. And so I can always look back at it and be like, when I'm down, I'll be like, hey, well, there are positives. But yeah, those two definitely help me. And then also just um like hanging out with family or friends, like not isolating myself is definitely a huge one for me to take care of myself.
I definitely isolate sometimes, and I've been working on making sure to push myself to not do that as much because it is I'm definitely an extrovert, and so it is really good for me to go and be around people, and it is a form of self-care for me. I know some people are introverts, and it's not necessarily a form of self-care for them. It can be stressful for them.
Hmm.
But just knowing that you're surrounded by people that you love is always so, so wonderful. And I'm so glad to hear that you are journaling and have that resource to look back on when times do get tough, because sometimes it's hard to see that light at the end of the tunnel when we're in such a difficult or dark place. But knowing that like a past version of yourself was looking out for future you is really cool.
Yeah, it's awesome.
I also feel like that highlights the value of you writing down your positives too. You don't need to just utilize your journal when you're having a rough day. And I think that's fantastic because when you are having a rough day, you don't just look back on like the doom and gloom, but you get to look back on those hopeful moments and like little sparks of joy and um,
Dreams, goals, all that good
dreams,
stuff.
goals,
Yeah.
yes, looking towards the future, appreciating the past. And I want to say to both of you, thank you for sharing that. Like sometimes self-care is hard. Um, you know, it's hard to journal. Maybe you need to schedule it in. Um, sometimes it's difficult reaching out to friends and you got to kind of give yourself that extra push. But, kind of highlighting the value of like feeling better or processing things more after doing those things.
And it's so important to remember as well because, like you said, when you're in those difficult times, whether it just be because of a situation or your mental health is not doing so great at the time, it can be difficult to practice that self care. But, like we were saying before, having a strong support network is really good in those moments because they can hopefully kind of start to pull you out of that a little bit, help you get involved in more self care activities, and really provide that support that they're supposed to be giving. Because when we're in dark places or having a difficult time, it's so difficult to do these things that are these little acts of self care along the way. And that is such an important thing to remember when we're having these suicide prevention conversations and when we're talking about how to be a support network, because it's not always calling the crisis line, or I don't know, it's not always going to the ER. Like it's not always at that level, but any level of suicidal thoughts are something that we need to take seriously. And we need to make sure that that person gets connected to support, no matter what level it is.
All right, Abby. So we are coming to a close, unfortunately. Um, I know I've sang my praises many times throughout this episode, but thank you so, so much for coming and sharing. You are genuinely an inspiration, and it has been incredible talking with you. But before we finish, could you share one thing or multiple things if you would like, you want our listeners to take away from this conversation and what that would be and why?
Yes, so I would definitely say, just know you're never alone. I feel like we tend to always get in our thoughts and feel like we're alone, but there's always support for you, whether it's a friend, whether it's a classmate, or an adult you trust, or again, even a crisis line. There's always going to be someone for you. Like, I know for the longest time, I have luckily I have a really good family that's supportive, but I also used to like rely on one of my favorite teachers and just like I feel like people don't realize like even like everyday people are there for you and you're never alone. And I just think that's so important for people to hear. And another thing I would definitely say has to be like so important and people should take away is just like the emphasis on self-care because it really does go a long way. Like I remember when I first got told it to practice self-care before, I was like, yeah, okay, like this is not gonna work. Like it's not like it's too much. Like and then when I actually started doing it, it is completely life-changing, and I generally think more people should get into it.
Thank you so much, Abby. For me, my takeaway from this conversation is young folks are doing amazing things in the community. And I say young folks being what, maybe like 5 years older than you, if that. But just absolutely, absolutely wonderful work that you're doing. And one thing that was really, really powerful for me in this conversation with you is hearing you talk about the power of peer-to-peer education. So, how it's different from when adults are teaching this content to people your own age teaching you this content, and why that kind of sticks with us a little bit more, makes us feel a little bit more comfortable having these conversations. So, I hope that
Mhm.
that really, really shines through in this episode, because hearing a young adult like yourself talk about this topic and help to reduce the stigma, not only on this podcast episode, but in your day-to-day life and in your school and your community, is just truly wonderful.
I have to say, biggest takeaway by far is like the strength and vulnerability, whether that's being vulnerable and asking for help or acknowledging that you're struggling or standing up in front of a class and talking about a really difficult topic, or just having these conversations, whether it's a peer or something that happens organically or it's a formal conversation, where you go into a health class and say we're going to talk about suicide prevention, but just being able to take those steps and have those kind of soft, I don't want to say soft, but like the very like revealing moments, and emotional, and being able to kind of dive into those, um, not only valuable for like processing, but for breaking the ice and starting change and really being able to initiate growth in your space, in your community.
I want to say thank you to you guys because I feel like the work that you guys are doing is so important too. Because definitely, like the podcasts and what you guys post on social media and stuff like that is completely the right way to reach our generation and our youth and community. So I really appreciate it because you guys are doing awesome work.
Oh, well, thank you. We really appreciate that.
Genuinely, as someone who feels old some of the times, while working with middle schoolers and high schoolers, I appreciate that. And if you ever have any feedback, Abby or any other young folks listening, we'd love to hear it.
Look, social media is hard for me, so to know that we're doing that right is fabulous, because I'm the one that runs the Instagram. So all good. So to our listeners, for more information on the Connect Suicide Prevention Program and how to bring it to your high school or community, visit theconnectprogram.org. So thank you again, Abby, for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time to speak with us about the important work that young adults like yourself are doing to keep our community safe and healthy and happy. And we wish you best of luck on your future projects.
And as always, thank you to our listeners. Your engagement with this podcast gives us the ability to continue sharing stories like these from our community. If you liked today's episode, consider sharing it on social media. And if you're interested in more 603 Stories content, visit us at 603stories.org or on Instagram by searching at 603 Stories. And that is the number 603 Stories.
Thanks for listening to the 603 Stories Podcast, a monthly podcast made by young adults for young adults. You can check out 603 Stories on Facebook or Instagram, or at our website, 603stories.org. Just a reminder, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline can be reached at 800-273-8255. That's 800-273-TALK. And the crisis text line can be reached by texting to 741-741. Remember, you can make connections, get help, and find hope through 603 Stories.